Well, if we then go a little further, a little deeper into the digital world, then I think that the kinds of authoring environments, for lack of a better word, that these things are created in just kind of ramp up that complexity of the context. So I love this story by Richard Reinhardt, who uh, worked at Pacific Film Archives and Berkeley Art Museum. And we got a knock on the door once, since this is California, from Pixar. We've created a new movie. It's called Toy Story. It's all computer graphic generated. So all the imagery, Woody and Buzz flying around, are all just bits on, that were manipulated to make this movie. And now there's the movie, and we want to preserve it. So the person he was working with at the time, who was a specialist in film, because the Pacific Film Archives has films going back, decades, started to go through, well, originally there was, forms of film that weren't safe. They'd get, vinegar syndrome and kind of disintegrate, or they would explode, literally combust in the middle of their spools. But now we've got safety film, and we make several copies and so forth. And the Pixar people looked at her and said, no, we don't want to preserve the film. We want to preserve the movie. And of course, she looked at them like they had two heads. But what they meant was that Toy Story is not the final product. It's not a piece of celluloid with frames with pictures of, Woody moving across the room. It's the 3D data set and all the algorithms that go into determining the ray tracing of the lighting and the actions of the limbs and so forth. And that's a much more powerful artifact to them to preserve than the actual printed film that film conservatives are trained to preserve,
Right.
right? So what do you do with that? How do you take this incredibly fertile kind of collection of data and the software that surrounds it and convince an industry like, the motion picture industry, that it's no longer about films in canisters. It's about this whole world of this incredibly fertile software. And you might say, well, why do they care? Wasn't that just something that they used to make the piece, and now that's done, they can throw it away and keep the film? But they're thinking, well, what if someday they have, 3D projection? Guess what we do now? What if someday people want to make a video game from it, and we're going to reuse the scenes, these
Mm.
3D models we're just going to show from different angles? What if we make a different version that's from, I don't know, Buzz's point of view instead of Woody's? Or there's so many options available in that kind of mother file, as Reinhardt calls it, that we don't really know how to deal with that.
The film industry has really been on the cutting edge of preservation in my experience. They because their digital assets or their film assets or their recording, their magnetic media assets, they have a lot of value, and so they're willing to put money into preserving them, and they really have pushed the envelope in all of those areas, in my experience. Not so much in the digital world do I have that experience, but I imagine it's true.
Hmm. Well, we'll see how well the digital world is amenable to the models that they've developed in the past.
Well, the film community hasn't been that. I mean, that hasn't uh, hasn't been that amenable actually. Because they don't have the resources to do it, to do the kind of preservation work that can be done by a film studio. It's very expensive to
Wait, so you're saying film community, meaning the people
the
who are,
the preservation community.
right?
They
Gotcha.
they can't really afford to.
As opposed to the commercial houses.
Right. Um, you see the model of the Library of Congress. I forgot what it's called. Where they're choosing one film a year to preserve. Forgot what that's called, but it's sort of the idea is sort of you know sort of like a reliquary
Hmm.
more, rather than a preservation program where you're keeping a
Right.
sample of this or that. I mean, one of our films got preserved by them, but then what about the other three or four hundred?
Right.
Um, yeah, so,
Well, then that brings up another question, which is the sort of triage, right? I
mm,
mean, if we go from a place where we had a standard way to deal with medium, like there was for years a standard way to deal with film, right? Standard way to deal with,
right,
paper documents. And now we live in this world where not just are the media becoming more ephemeral more quickly, but they're also splintering into numerous types, right? So we've got, just in the last, decade, um, the video formats have gone crazy. There's, D1 and D2 and Betacam and those guys, which have been around for a little while. But now there's the codecs that come from the digital world.
Right.
You've got your proprietary, Microsoft and Apple QuickTime. You've got MPEG-4. You've got WebM. There's so many codecs out there that it's really hard to keep track of them. So, what do you think? Should people say, we can't do everything. We're just going to pick one and then just preserve everything in that particular medium? And how long will that last?
Um, I don't see much choice, but uh, there are two or three uh, media that they could choose as preservation media for moving images, and so everyone's not using the same thing anyway. So, um, I guess every institution has to decide for themselves what they're going to do.
So that brings up the next question, which is, should preservation be a centralized decision? Should there be sort of experts in a room who say, this is the right, we're going to use MXF JPEG for film, and we're going to pick, Hollywood pieces, the blockbuster, the Academy Award winners say every year. They kind of make the choices about where the investment and where the attention should be, and then everybody goes on that and kind of all tackles it at once like a barn raising. Or should it be that individual institutions say, hey, we don't really care about Hollywood. We, Anthology Film Archives, we look at avant-garde film, and we think that's what's important and what people are frankly going to remember from the century. So we're going to focus on preserving that.
Well, I think that's how it works now. The second thing you said, that every institution decides for itself what its priorities are. Do I think it would be a good thing to have it centralized? No, I don't. I think we got a better chance of getting a sampling of the present for the future if there's a diverse group of institutions and individuals who are working according to their own predilections. What I do think is useful to have centralized are 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 tools that are developed according to the needs of the user community, and that is sort of happening. There's no official leader, but different institutions are creating different tools to do digital preservation, and that's a useful thing. But people are going to use what works for them in their own situation, and it's sort of participatory democracy. uh, whatever people use is what is going to become whatever people find the easiest to use or the most useful is going to be the consensus standard, just like it was with the internet. Frankly, the internet in the U.S. was not the official network standard for many years, but people ignored the official standard, the name of which I've even forgotten now. But for a number of years, systems administrators resisted the official standard until finally it just broke down.
Well, I think that's like you say, almost like a Darwinian product, right? If you let people choose their own tools and destiny, they will pick things that aren't necessarily the ones the centralized forces would choose, and often for the better. The classic example is preserving video games, where the tools have been made not even by any form of centralization, but by a dispersed community of fanboys and girls working away on these emulators in their basements. And these are tremendously powerful and well-evolved systems that have often involved these kind of dispersed collaborations over time and geographically disparate coders inventing a way to play, Oregon Trail or, Legend of Zelda on a contemporary PC.
Sure.
So that's a great example of what you're talking about, the sort of participatory democracy side. But I also think that some people get nervous about the effects on that sort of triage system, meaning that, it's great that we have these emulators to save, hit Nintendo titles and so forth, but what about the culture that might be chosen by curators in museums or by Hollywood, or I should say, film critics, if there is a kind of popularity contest in the choice of what gets preserved, isn't that going to replace, sort of high culture with a sort of lowest common divisor?
I think that the high culture will always have the resources at to preserve itself because it's high culture. Uh, High culture is associated with the elite and with money, and that's going to be there. Um, I don't worry about that too much. The 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 other cultures, there's various minority cultures you might want to worry about, but I don't worry about that.
Hmm. Well, as someone with a background as an artist, I don't really associate cutting edge of culture with money. I know that it can often end up that way. But I do agree with you that a lot of the concerns about the over democratization of preservation are unfounded, and they're really based on a pretty a kind of retro feeling that is the job of, say, a museum to control what people see and what gets passed on. And when that job is increasingly being done outside of the institution, which I believe it is in the digital world, curators and museum directors get nervous. But I think it is the job of us as digital curators to imagine other forms of cultural preservation that go beyond that centralized kind of gatekeeping.
Sure, but and there is concern about that. But there are, I know, for example, there's what you might call digital archives that have been created as through online communities that have, for example, documented neighborhoods or or all kinds of things, uh, and they're doing things that archivists are not positioned to do. They don't have the resources to do. They couldn't replicate it, and it's a good thing. It's a positive thing. Indeed, some archivists are really trying to facilitate this process of community archiving, they call it. And at the very least, I think we should be preserving those websites where they're putting up all these scanned documents relating to the history that is important to them.
Right, there are archives for 9/11 and a number of events where people were able to just submit whatever they had, and that became part of this public kind of
Right,
record.
but I think this is happening more in the UK than the US, where there are these community archive sites where people put up their own documents relating to history of a particular place. Usually a place, I guess it could be a school or any number of other things, but it is outside the rubric of any institution, just something they do.
Mhm.
That's part of the new digital world.